10:07 p.m., September 12, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Werner Hartenstein stood in the conning tower of U-156, deep in the South Atlantic, 185 miles northeast of Ascension Island. Through his periscope, he had just targeted a British passenger ship. 2 torpedoes sliced through the black waves, the first hit, then the second. The ship, RMS Laconia, began to sink. A perfect execution. Another sinking for the war log. Little did Hartenstein know at that moment that the next 48 hours would turn him into a legend, not because of the attack itself, but because of what followed. As he surfaced to inspect the wreckage, he heard something that chilled him to the bone. Hundreds of voices, screaming in English, Polish, Italian. Children were crying, women were calling for help. The water was full of people. Over 2,000 souls were fighting for survival, and Hartenstein was facing the impossible decision of his life. The RMS Laconia was no ordinary troop transport. On board were 2,732 people, 809 Italian prisoners of war, being transported to South Africa by the British, 463 British crew members and soldiers, 268 British civilians, including women and children, 160 Polish soldiers as guards. When the torpedoes struck, chaos erupted. The Italian prisoners were locked below deck. As water rushed in, hundreds drowned instantly. The British crew desperately tried to launch the lifeboats, but in the darkness, with the ship sinking within 30 minutes, it was nearly impossible. Panic spread. People jumped into the ice-cold water. Lifeboats capsized. Others clung to debris. The Laconia disaster had begun, and Werner Hartenstein had no idea what he had just unleashed. When U-156 surfaced after the attack to search for survivors and possibly take prisoners for interrogation, Hartenstein was overwhelmed by the sight. The sea was black with people. Hundreds were drifting in the water. Many were injured. Others were barely staying afloat. The screams were deafening. And then it dawned on him. These weren't just British soldiers. These were Italian prisoners, allies, technically his own people. But there were also civilians, women, children. Werner Hartenstein was 34 years old, born in Plauen, Saxony, raised in a family of officers. He had experienced World War I as a child. His father had been an officer, his grandfather too. The Navy was his life. He wasn't an ideologue, he was a soldier, a professional. In his previous patrols, U-156 had already sunk several Allied ships. He was good at his job, efficient, precise, but he also had principles. He treated prisoners with respect. He followed the laws of naval warfare. And now he was facing a situation for which there was no manual. Before him in the water were over 1,000 people drowning. Technically, some of them were allies, but even the enemies were human beings. And Hartenstein had grown up with stories of naval honor, about the duty to rescue the shipwrecked. It was an unwritten law of the sea, older than any war, older than any nation. Hartenstein stood still for a long moment. His officers waited for orders. The U-boat was vulnerable on the surface. Any Allied aircraft or warship nearby would attack them immediately. Standard procedure was clear: dive and disappear. But Hartenstein couldn't move. He saw the face of a little girl clinging to a piece of wood. He heard the desperate cries of the Italian prisoners, and then he heard something that changed everything. A voice, weak but clear, called out in German, "Hilfe! Helft uns! Wir sind Italiener! Verbündete! Bitte! Help! Help us! We are Italians! Allies! Please!" The Italian prisoners of war were calling out to him. They recognized the German U-boat, and they were begging for rescue. In that moment, Werner Hartenstein made a decision that defied all military logic. He gave the order to begin the rescue. The crew of U-156 was shocked. Some protested. They were in the middle of enemy territory. The U-boat could hold a maximum of 50 additional people, and that was only in extremely cramped conditions. But outside, there were over 1,000 people in the water. It was mathematically impossible to save everyone. But Hartenstein repeated the order, "Get them out! Everyone we can!" The rescue itself was chaotic and emotionally overwhelming. The German sailors, young men in their 20s, had never seen anything like it. They were trained to sink ships, not to save lives, but now they were pulling people from the water, people who, hours earlier, had been their enemies. One German sailor, Rudolf Bahr, 22 years old from Hamburg, later recalled, "I saw a British soldier who was barely conscious. He was hypothermic, blue in the face. I pulled him on board. He looked at me. And then he recognized my uniform. I saw fear in his eyes. He thought I was going to kill him, but I gave him my jacket. I gave him water. And then he cried, not from fear, from relief, from gratitude. I understood at that moment. We are all just human beings trying to survive." The first to be rescued were the Italian prisoners of war. They were closest to the U-boat in the water. Many were in bad shape. They had been in British captivity for months, malnourished, exhausted, and now, after hours in the cold Atlantic, they were on the brink of death. The German sailors worked feverishly. They pulled man after man on board. They distributed blankets. They gave warm coffee from the U-boat's limited supplies. Every U-boat had limited resources, designed for a crew of 52 men. And now there were over 200 people on board. And so began one of the most extraordinary rescue operations in naval history. The German sailors threw ropes into the water. They pulled people on board, Italians, British, Polish. It didn't matter. Everyone who could reach their hands was rescued. A British officer, Captain Rudolph Sharp, who commanded the British troops aboard the Laconia, later described his rescue. "I was sure we were going to die. When I saw the German U-boat, I thought that was the end. But then they threw ropes. They helped us on board. A German sailor, no older than my own son, gave me his ration of bread. He didn't speak English, I didn't speak German. But he smiled, and I understood. We were no longer enemies in that moment. We were survivors. But the U-boat was filling up fast. After 90 minutes, there were 193 people on board. The boat could no longer dive. It was a sitting duck, and Lieutenant Commander Hartenstein knew it. The first officer, Lieutenant Mannesmann, came to him. "Captain, we have to dive. We're completely vulnerable here. Any Allied aircraft will destroy us. We've done our duty. We've saved as many as possible. But now we have to think of our own crew." Hartenstein looked at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "No, we can't just leave the others in the water. There are hundreds more. Children, women, our Italian comrades. We stay." Mannesmann was desperate. "But Captain, the orders, the protocol. We're not just risking our boat, we're risking the lives of 52 German sailors." Hartenstein turned to him. His voice was firm, but not angry. "I know, but if we dive now, we're no better than the ones we're fighting. We are German officers. We have a code of honor, and that code says we rescue shipwrecked sailors, no matter who they are." It was a moment that defined Hartenstein. He placed principles over protocol, humanity over military efficiency, but he didn't give the order to stop. Instead, he did something even more incredible. He went to the radio room. The radio operator, Chief Petty Officer Werner Hirschfeld, 24 years old from Bremen, looked at him in amazement as Hartenstein dictated the text. An unencrypted message. In English. To all Allied ships in the vicinity. Hirschfeld hesitated. "Captain, an unencrypted message reveals our exact position. Every enemy warship, every aircraft. They'll find us." Hartenstein nodded. "I know. But this is the only way. Send it. Urdin. The message sent at 01:25 a.m. on September 13, 1942, was unprecedented in naval warfare history. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her, providing I'm not being attacked by ship or air forces. I have picked up 193 men. Position: 4 degrees 52 minutes south, 11 degrees 26 minutes west, German submarine. It was an unprecedented act. A German U-boat commander in the middle of a war, sending his exact position to the Allies, asking for help to save enemy lives. An act that defied all military logic, but an act that showed that Werner Hartenstein was willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. But the reaction that came was not what Hartenstein expected. The Allied High Command was suspicious. They believed it was a trap, a trick to lure Allied rescue ships into an ambush. Hours passed. No help came. U-156 drifted on the surface, overcrowded with over 200 people. The deck was full of survivors. Many were injured. German medics tended to British soldiers. Italian prisoners sat next to Polish guards. Enemies who hours before would have killed each other were now sharing water and bread. It was surreal. A small island of humanity in the middle of the most brutal conflict in history. But the danger was immense. Every minute on the surface increased the risk. Hartenstein knew he was risking his boat and his entire crew. But he couldn't give up. He radioed again, and finally, after agonizing hours, an answer came. The French warship Gloire, which was under Vichy control and therefore technically neutral, responded. They were coming, but it would take hours. Hartenstein made another critical decision. He couldn't wait. He had to call more U-boats for help. He radioed U-boat command in Berlin. The reaction was mixed. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commander of the U-boat fleet, was initially furious. Keeping a U-boat on the surface for so long was insane. Dönitz practically screamed through the radio. "Hartenstein, you're risking an entire U-boat for enemies. This is strategic madness. Dive immediately. That's an order." But Hartenstein replied calmly, "Admiral, there are over 100 Italian soldiers on board. Our allies. I can't abandon them." There was a long pause. Dönitz understood the implication. If German U-boats let Italian soldiers drown while they watched, it would be a diplomatic and moral scandal. The Axis powers would be weakened, Mussolini would be furious, and in a deeper sense, it would be a betrayal of everything the German Navy stood for. Dönitz changed his mind. "All right, Hartenstein, I'm sending reinforcements, but you remain in command. If anything goes wrong, it's your responsibility." He ordered U-506 under Lieutenant Commander Erich Würdemann and U-507 under Lieutenant Commander Haro Schacht to rush to the position immediately. Additionally, the Italian submarine Capellini under Captain Marco Revedin was contacted. Over the next 24 hours, something extraordinary unfolded. 4 U-boats, 3 German and 1 Italian, converged in the South Atlantic, all with one goal: to save people from the water, enemies and allies alike. U-506 reached the scene on the morning of September 13th. Lieutenant Commander Würdemann, 29 years old, from Hamburg, was an experienced commander. He had already sunk several Allied ships, but what he saw now shocked him. The sea was still full of people. Lifeboats were drifting everywhere, and U-156 was dangerously low in the water, overloaded with over 200 survivors. Würdemann immediately gave the order to begin the rescue. His crew, initially confused, followed suit. They pulled British soldiers from the water. They distributed their own water rations. A sailor from U-506, Kevin Keller, 20 years old, from Munich, later wrote in his diary, "Today, I saved a British soldier. He was unconscious. I thought he was dead. But as we pulled him on board, he started breathing. He opened his eyes. He looked at me. And then he said in broken German, 'Thank you. Thank you, comrade.' I cried. I don't know why. Maybe because I realized that we're all just men trying to get home. U-507, under Lieutenant Commander Harrow Schacht, arrived in the afternoon. Schacht was known as a strict disciplinarian, a professional through and through, but even he was overwhelmed by the scene. He took over the coordination of the lifeboats. U-507 towed 4 large lifeboats, packed with survivors, through the water. The crew distributed provisions. They repaired damaged boats. A British colonel, David Kingsley, who was in one of those boats, later described the surreal experience. There we were, British officers, in a lifeboat, being towed by a German U-boat. The German sailors were throwing us food. They were repairing our oars. One of them, a young man with blonde hair, handed us a compass card so we could find the coastline if we got separated. He saluted us. We saluted back. It was the most absurd and beautiful moment of my life. The Italian U-boat Capellini, under Captain Marco Revedin, arrived last. The Italians were emotionally overwhelmed. Most of the rescued were Italian soldiers, their own countrymen. Revedin crammed as many aboard as physically possible. Over 70 Italian prisoners were transferred to the Capellini. The Italian sailors embraced them. They wept together. One of the rescued Italians, Private Luigi Mariano from Naples, later recounted, "I thought I'd never see Italy again. I had made peace with death, but then I heard Italian voices. My own language. Hands pulled me from the water, and when I saw the Italian flag on the U-boat, I broke down. I had come home, even in the middle of the Atlantic, on a U-boat. I had come home." It was a moment that demonstrated that even in the darkest war, humanity could survive. 4 U-boats, technically instruments of death, became lifeboats. Their crews, trained to kill, saved lives. They towed lifeboats, they distributed supplies, they treated the wounded. German sailors worked side by side with British survivors to pull more people from the water. Italian prisoners helped Polish guards. It was a temporary suspension of the war, a moment where humanity was stronger than hatred. But then, the inevitable happened. On September 16, 1942, at 11:25 a.m., 72 hours after the initial torpedoing, U-156 was spotted by an American B-24 Liberator bomber from the U.S. Army Air Force. The aircraft, part of the 343rd Bombardment Squadron, based on Ascension Island, was flying routine patrols. The pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, 26 years old from Colorado, saw something unusual through his binoculars. A U-boat, on the surface, completely unprotected, a perfect target. Lieutenant Commander Hartenstein had tried everything to identify himself. He'd painted a giant red cross symbol on his deck, assembled from red signal flags. Almost 13 feet wide, he had the large identifier on the conning tower, "Rescue operation in progress, do not attack." He radioed on all Allied frequencies. German submarine conducting rescue operations, over 150 survivors on board, request no attack, international law protection requested. He'd even asked British survivors to wave from the deck so any reconnaissance plane could see that there were civilians aboard. But Lieutenant Harden had strict orders from his commanding officer, Captain Robert C. Richardson III. The orders were absolutely clear. Any German U-boat is to be sunk immediately upon sighting. No exceptions, no delays, no questions. Those were the orders. And Harden was a soldier. He followed orders. He flew lower to verify the target, and then He saw it, the Red Cross, the people on the deck. He counted at least 100 people. Many were waving, some were clearly civilians, women, possibly children. Hardin hesitated. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Howard, called through the intercom. "Sir, those are survivors. That's a rescue operation. We can't attack. That would be against the Geneva Convention." Hardin knew it, but he also thought about his orders, about the hundreds of Allied ships that had been sunk by German U-boats, about the thousands of sailors who had drowned without German U-boats offering assistance. He thought, this could be a trap. They could be using the survivors as human shields, and so he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He attacked. The B-24 banked around, Hardin aimed, and he released the first two bombs. The first narrowly missed. The second exploded 30 feet from the U-boat. The shockwave threw people from the deck. The Red Cross was torn apart. Panic erupted. Hartenstein, standing on the conning tower, yelled, "Everyone in the water! Immediately! We have to dive!" The German sailors, in panic, desperately helped the survivors overboard. It was chaos. People jumped. Others were pushed. Some clung to the railing, refusing to let go, afraid of the water. A British doctor, Dr. Graham, who was aboard U-156, later described the horror. "I saw the bombs falling. I heard the whistling, and then the explosion. People were flying through the air. I heard screams. German sailors, who had just been helping us, were now yelling at us to jump. One of them, a young sailor, whom I had treated for a burn, grabbed me and threw me overboard. He saved my life. I never saw him again." An Italian survivor, Giuseppe Bianchi, recalled, "I was just on the deck. I had a mug of warm coffee in my hand that a German sailor had given me. And then I heard the plane. I looked up. I saw the bombs falling. Everything went slow motion. I saw people running. Then the explosion. I was thrown into the water. When I came up, the U-boat was diving. People were screaming in the water. Some were injured. Blood in the water. It was hell." Hartenstein had no choice. If he didn't dive immediately, the next wave of bombs would hit the U-boat and everyone would die. His crew, the survivors on board, all of them. He gave the order, "Dive, now!" The hatches were sealed. The U-boat began to descend, but over 50 people were still on deck. They jumped at the last second. The U-boat disappeared beneath the waves just as the next wave of bombs came. 2 more bombs exploded. One hit a lifeboat directly. 16 people died instantly. The other exploded in the water, right where survivors were swimming. The shockwave killed at least 10 more people. Their internal organs were ruptured by the pressure. Underwater, U-156 was damaged. The proximity of the explosions had dented the hull. Water was seeping in, but the boat held. Hartenstein sat in the command room, his head in his hands. His first officer, Mannesmann, tried to comfort him. "Captain, you did what you could. We saved hundreds. This wasn't your fault." But Hartenstein just shook his head. He kept muttering, "They attacked us. During a rescue, they saw the Red Cross, and they attacked anyway." Above water, the scene was devastating. Survivors, who had just been safe on the U-boat, were now back in the water. Many were injured. Some were floating unconscious. The rescue boats, they tried to gather them up, but the morale, it was utterly broken. A British nurse, let's call her Dorothy Baker, who survived the entire ordeal. She later wrote, "In that moment, I didn't hate the Germans. I hated the Americans. The Germans had saved us. They had risked their lives for us, and our own allies had bombed us. It was the most absurd, the most tragic moment of the war." Lieutenant Commander Hardin. He flew back to base. He reported, "U-boat sunk, mission successful." But the U-boat wasn't sunk. It had submerged, and Hardin knew. He had done something terrible. Years later, in an interview in 1987, not long before his death, he said, "I was following orders, but I knew it was wrong. I saw the survivors. I saw the Red Cross, but I was afraid of disobeying my orders. I thought I'd be court-martialed, so I attacked. It was the worst decision of my life. I dreamed about it every night, the faces of the people on the deck, the screams. I killed while thinking I was serving my country. God, forgive me." The attack had consequences far beyond the immediate victims. In total, 26 people died from Hardin's bombs, 16 in the directly hit lifeboat, 10 more from the shockwaves in the water. But the psychological scars, those ran deeper. Lieutenant Commander Hartenstein, he was devastated. The other U-boat commanders, guys like Verdeman of U-506 and Schacht from U-507, they were furious. They radioed Berlin. "We were attacked during a humanitarian rescue. This is a war crime." But Admiral Dönitz, he saw things very differently. The story could have ended there. A tragic attempt to show humanity, crushed by the harsh realities of war. But the Laconia disaster, it had not yet reached its conclusion. The other U-boats. They continued the rescue. Over the next few days, a total of 1,083 people were saved. Out of the 2,732 who'd been aboard the Laconia, 1,083 survived. That means 1,649 people died. It was a tragedy, but without Hartenstein and the other U-boat commanders, all of them would have died. The survivors, they were transferred to Allied and neutral ships. British soldiers rescued by German U-boats. Italian prisoners owing their freedom to their German enemies. It was complex, it was contradictory, it was profoundly human. The Allies, they were deeply impressed and equally ashamed by what had happened. British survivors reported on the extraordinary humanity of the German crew. They told stories of how German sailors shared their own rations, how they cared for the wounded, how they risked losing their own lives to save enemies. A British officer who'd been rescued, he later wrote, "I saw the face of true soldierly honor that day. Those men, they could have simply let us drown. No one would have ever known, but they chose humanity. That's something I will never forget." The story, it spread, first as a rumor, then as a confirmed fact. A German U-boat captain risking his own life to save enemy lives. But the consequences for the German Navy, they were dramatic and far-reaching. Admiral Karl Dönitz, he was absolutely livid about the American attack when he received Hartenstein's radio message that they'd been bombed during the rescue. He practically exploded. He screamed at his aides. They attacked him while he was displaying a Red Cross, while he was rescuing shipwrecked sailors. This is a war crime. It's a breach of every civilized law of warfare. Dönitz, he felt personally betrayed. He had allowed Hartenstein to continue the rescue. He had sent additional U-boats. He had acted against his own military instincts because he believed in the code of honor of the sea, and the Allies, they had answered that belief with bombs. On September 17th, 1942, one day after the attack, Dönitz issued the infamous Laconia Order. The official title was Order Number 154, but it became forever known as the Laconia Order. The text was brutally direct. All attempts to rescue survivors of sunken ships are to cease immediately. This includes pulling shipwrecked sailors from the water, righting capsized lifeboats, providing food and water. Rescue contradicts the most primitive demands of warfare for the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. The safety of one's own boat takes absolute priority. It was a chilling order. From then on, German U-boats were instructed to no longer attempt any rescues. No survivors, no risks, just sink and disappear. Many U-boat commanders were shocked. Some protested. Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Hardigan, one of the most successful U-boat aces, he wrote in his war log, "Today is a dark day for the German Navy. We are not murderers, we are soldiers. But this order, it turns us into monsters." Another commander, Heinrich Lehmann-Willenbrock, he radioed Dönitz directly. "Herr Admiral, this order contradicts everything we stand for. The honor of the Navy is being stained." But Dönitz, he was adamant. His response was curt. "The enemy has broken the rules, not us. We are simply adapting." The order was controversial, not only morally, but also legally. After the war, at the Nuremberg trials in 1946, Dönitz was put on trial. The Laconia Order was presented as key evidence of war crimes. The prosecution argued that the order effectively commanded U-boat commanders to let survivors die, which violated the Geneva Convention. Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, the chief British prosecutor, he read the order aloud and asked Dönitz directly, "Do you admit that this order condemned thousands of sailors to an agonizing death by drowning and hypothermia?" Dönitz, 55 years old, grey and weary, but still proud, he replied, "The Laconia Order was issued after Allied aircraft attacked German U-boats that were conducting humanitarian rescue operations. We were following all the rules of naval warfare. We marked our boats, we sent unencrypted messages, and we were bombed. The order was a necessary measure to protect German crews. We did not actively kill survivors. We only stopped rescuing them. But the defense, it had an ace up its sleeve." Dönitz's lawyer, Otto Kranzbühler, he called a surprise witness. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Kranzbühler posed a simple question. "Admiral Nimitz, did the U.S. Navy have similar orders regarding Japanese survivors in the Pacific?" Nimitz, under oath, had to admit, yes. After Pearl Harbor, there were unrestricted submarine warfare orders. American submarines were instructed to sink Japanese ships without warning and to undertake no rescue attempts if it endangered the safety of the U-boat. It was a shocking admission. The Allies had pursued exactly the same policy. The only difference was that Dönitz had issued his order in writing, while the American policy was implicit. The court was in an impossible position. How could they condemn Dönitz for something the Allies themselves had done? Ultimately, Dönitz was not convicted for the Laconia Order. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for other war crimes. But the Laconia Order itself was deemed legal in the context of unrestricted submarine warfare. The decision was controversial. Many survivors of the Laconia disaster felt betrayed. They had witnessed German U-boat crews risking their lives to save them, and now the admiral who had ordered those commanders to stop was practically acquitted. Dorothy Baker, the British nurse who had been rescued on U-156, wrote an open letter in 1947. "Dönitz isn't the problem. Harden isn't the problem. The problem is war itself. War takes good men and forces them to make inhuman decisions. Hartenstein was a good man. Harden thought he was a good soldier. Both were following orders. Both were destroyed by a system larger than they were. That is the true tragedy." The consequences of the Laconia Order were far-reaching. After September 1942, German U-boats virtually stopped rescuing Allied sailors. Thousands of sailors who could have been saved drowned instead. Survival rates after ship sinkings plummeted dramatically. Before the Laconia Order, about 30% of sailors from sunken ships were rescued. often by the U-boats themselves, or through their assistance in contacting rescue vessels. After the order, that rate dropped to under 10%. This means that the Laconia incident and the resulting order indirectly led to the deaths of thousands more sailors. It was a tragedy that rippled out over years. Werner Hartenstein did not survive the war. His story ends tragically. But predictably, in March 1943, 6 months after the Laconia incident, U-156 was on patrol in the Caribbean, about 120 miles northwest of Barbados. It was March 8th, a clear day. Hartenstein was still in command. His crew loved him. Despite everything that had happened, despite the Laconia order, they trusted him absolutely. He was a leader who stood up for his principles, but on that day, the crew had no chance. An American PBY Catalina flying boat spotted U-156 on the surface. Hartenstein tried to dive, but it was too late. The plane dropped a series of depth charges. The first one hit directly. U-156 exploded and there were no survivors. All 52 crew members, including Werner Hartenstein, died. He was 34 years old, married. His wife, Elizabeth, was waiting in Germany. She only learned of his death weeks later. She received an official letter. "Your husband died in service to the fatherland," but there were no details, no explanation, only missing at sea, presumed fallen. Years later, after the war, when the archives were opened, Elizabeth learned the whole story about Laconia, about the rescue, about the 193 people her husband had taken aboard, about the hundreds more who were saved through his coordination. She wept as she read it, not from grief, although the grief was always there, but from pride. She told her daughter, Ursula, "Your father was not a war hero. He was a human hero. That's a difference the world doesn't often understand." But Hartenstein's act lived on, long after his death. In Germany, he was celebrated as a hero, but not in the way war heroes are normally celebrated. Not for the ships he had sunk, not for his military efficiency, but for the humanity he showed, for the choice he made when no one was watching. In the 1950s, as Germany grappled with its wartime past, Hartenstein became a symbol that not all German soldiers were monsters, that some, even in the context of a terrible regime, could preserve humanity. In Britain, the reaction was more complex and evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, the mood was anti-German. Many Brits didn't want to hear about German heroes, but the survivors of Laconia spoke out. Captain Rudolf Sharp, the British officer who had been rescued by U-156, gave lectures. He told his story, and slowly public opinion shifted. In 1956, for the first time, Hartenstein was referred to as an honourable enemy in a British newspaper. In 1967, an article about him was published in The Times. The title, "The U-Boat Captain Who Chose Humanity Over War." The survivors of Laconia met for years. They formed a survivors association, and every year, on September 12th, the anniversary of the torpedoing, they held a memorial. They honoured the 1,649 who died, but they also honoured Werner Hartenstein and his crew. Dorothy Baker, the British nurse, said at one of these meetings in 1972, "We are here because of a German U-boat captain who decided that lives were more important than orders. Without him, we would all be dead. That must never be forgotten." In 1979, a small plaque was unveiled in Liverpool. It reads, "In memory of the 1,649 victims of the RMS Laconia disaster, September 12, 1942, and to the brave men of the U-boats U-156, U-506, U-507, and Capellini who tried to rescue them." It was an extraordinary moment. a British city unveiling a memorial to German U-boat crews. Some veterans protested. They said it was a betrayal, but the majority understood. Captain Sharp, by now 76 years old, was present at the unveiling. He said, "This is not a memorial to the enemy. This is a memorial to humanity. Hartenstein was my enemy, but he was also my savior. Both can be true." Decades after the war, memorials were erected in various locations. In Plauen, Saxony, Hartenstein's birthplace, there's a small museum. It showcases his life, his career, and the Laconia incident. School classes visit it. They learn about the war, but they also learn about decisions, about morality, about the possibility of doing what's right. Even when everything around you says you shouldn't, survivors who had met Lieutenant Commander Hartenstein personally told their stories to their children and grandchildren. These stories were passed down, generation after generation. A grandson of a rescued British soldier, Michael Thompson, wrote a book in 2005 about his grandfather. The title, "Saved by the Enemy: My Grandfather's War." He described how his grandfather, Private Thomas Thompson, was pulled from the water by German sailors, how they gave him their last chocolate, how they bandaged his wounds, and how for the rest of his life he said, "I was saved by enemies who were more human than many friends I knew." The story was documented, analyzed, and portrayed in films. In 2011, a BBC documentary was produced, The Sinking of the Laconia. It told the entire story, with interviews from surviving family members, with archival footage, with war log entries from German sailors and British survivors. The film aired in Germany, Great Britain, and the United States. Millions watched it, and many wept. What moved people the most wasn't the action, not the explosions or the drama. It was the small moments. The German sailor who gave his jacket to a British soldier. The Italian prisoner who hugged a Polish guard after they were both rescued. Lieutenant Commander Hartenstein standing in the conning tower, exhausted and desperate, but still determined to do what was right. These moments showed that even in war, humanity isn't dead. It's just hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to show it. What Hartenstein did on that September day in 1942 was more than a rescue operation. It was a demonstration of something rare in war, the choice to put humanity above military advantage. He could have simply submerged. No one would have ever known. His U-boat would have been safe, but he decided differently. He decided to do what was right, even when it was dangerous. And for that, he paid the ultimate price. But the 1,083 people who survived lived. They had families. They told this story, and this story became part of something larger, proof that even in the darkest times, even in the most brutal conflict, people can choose. They can choose to be monsters or humans. Hartenstein chose humanity, and that makes him a true hero. These aren't just statistics from dusty archives. These are the moments that decided the fate of thousands. Real people, real decisions, real consequences. Werner Hartenstein is dead, but his actions live on. These stories must never be forgotten. If these historical truths are important to you, then support me with YouTube's Super Thanks, the golden heart below. Every Super Thanks allows me to spend weeks in naval archives, digitizing old radio logs, interviewing surviving witnesses, documenting wreck sites. Help me preserve this story for generations to come, because if we forget what people like Hartenstein did, we forget what humanity is capable of. The story of Werner Hartenstein and the Laconia incident teaches us something profound. It shows that war isn't just black and white, that enemies are people, that honor can exist, even when everything around you is trying to destroy it. Hartenstein was recognized by the British Admiralty after the war as an honorable opponent. Survivors of the Laconia wrote letters to his family, expressing their gratitude. Some even visited Germany to visit his grave. They said that Hartenstein not only saved their lives, but also their faith in humanity. That even in war, people can choose to do what is right. Today, over 80 years later, a small plaque stands on the coast of Cornwall. It commemorates the victims of the Laconia, but it also remembers the German U-boat crews who tried to help. It's a rare monument, a memorial to enemies and allies together, for those who died and for those who tried to save. The inscription reads simply, "In memory of all who were lost, and to those who did not forget that we are all human." Werner Hartenstein isn't mentioned by name there, but his actions are implied. In every word, in every line, the Laconia story is complex. It has no simple heroes or villains. The American pilot who attacked U-156 was following orders. The British soldiers who initially didn't trust a German U-boat were acting out of experience. Hartenstein himself had torpedoed Laconia, which cost 1,649 people their lives. But amidst all this complexity, there is a clear moment of clarity. When Hartenstein had the choice between safety and humanity, he chose humanity. And that, in its simplest form, is heroism. The German sailors who participated in the rescue rarely spoke about it. Many didn't survive the war, but those who did carried the memory with them. They told their families, they wrote in diaries, and their words reveal something amazing. They didn't speak of heroism, they spoke of duty, of the duty to do what is right, even when it's hard. One sailor wrote, "We were not heroes, we were men who made a choice." Each of us could have acted differently, but our captain showed us the way, and we followed. That is all. What impressed you the most? Many viewers have shared incredible family stories, grandfathers who were there, letters found in attics, war logs that lasted generations. Share your family story from this time below. Every comment is a piece of history that we preserve together. Have you heard of similar acts, of moments where enemies treated each other as humans? These stories are rare, but they exist, and they need to be told.